is this so-called discussion at the moment with certain political personalities or personalities for that matter that, there's such a thing as, an impending threat, impending threat from China. I think it talks about military.
Yeah. Well, if China wanted really to threaten the Philippines, it should have done that years back and taken over the Philippines. I mean, let's look at it more positively. Right now, I would like to suggest to the policymakers of the Marcos administration to reinvigorate the bilateral dialogue mechanisms between China and the Philippines that was established between the Duterte government and Xi Jinping way back in 2017 to resolve all pending bilateral conflicts, including the South China Sea and so on and so forth. But then again, just 1 or 2 weeks ago, well, Wang Yi, the foreign minister, came to the Philippines, and both Wang Yi and President Marcos agreed that the South China Sea issue is not the sum total of Philippine-China relations. We have other matters to deal with, like trade, economic cooperation, people-to-people, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. No? Let not the South China Sea be the stumbling block to possible opportunities of cooperation under the new administration. I'd rather look at it. Well, historically, I can say right now that, in fact, China since 1949 has been able to resolve 24 of its 27 territorial disputes peacefully without resorting to any military action. And the objective of those negotiations were to really to come up with a treaty of non-aggression and a peace agreement. So that's where, that's why I say that let us be more productive, more constructive, and use the available mechanisms that are there. It's unfortunate that Philippine ambassador to China, Chito Santa Romana, who did his best to use these mechanisms, passed away last April, and there's no, I think no new ambassador has been appointed to Beijing.
Yes, thank you, Professor Bobby. Dr. Dan, what's your opinion on this? That the Marcos administration is to uphold 2016 Arbitral Award, but still engage with China in terms of economic projects, and the AFP is intensifying or trying to modernize our defense capabilities to offer deterrence at the same time. But usually some personalities would refer to that deterrence, and the object of that deterrence is the so-called impending threat from China. So what's your reaction to this? And what's your perspective? Is there some truth to it that, there's such a thing as a China threat to the vis-a-vis the Philippines?
I think that threat picture has been exaggerated almost out of extinction here. I think it's very unfortunate and potentially worrisome in that it is almost as if the previous administration, and I do not mean the Duterte administration, but the Aquino administration, which made the deals, for instance, with these pogos and these gamers to come to Philippines, and gave basically an illicit industry in China free room to maneuver, something that President Duterte was against, but there was a very difficult situation in the early days of the pandemic, so that was allowed. Sometimes I can't help but wonder, why would you make a deal with this kind of an industry at that kind of a time, when there's so much talk about arbitration and the use of that decision? Unless, of course, you want to have a scapegoat, a physical face, a target that you can say, point out to people and say that they are the reason for your misery. They are the reason for your economic malaise. They are because we are being held back. We saw what happened with this kind of sentiments in the early days of the pandemic. you had an explosion of hate crimes against the Chinese in the United States and somewhat also in Europe. And they didn't stop at that. There were spillovers against all Asians. It reminded me of the terrible days after 9/11 when Indian immigrants, Sikhs, were attacked because people thought that they were possibly Osama bin Laden. Or when a friend of mine who was a Finnish ambassador wanted to enter the United States, and his name in Finnish is Osmo. The immigration official thought this is dangerous and close to Osama. Let's have an investigation. When people exaggerate these kind of threats, only bad things will ensue. And I think that the slide I offered earlier about the independent foreign policy is relevant. Where does this picture of threat come from? It comes from the images that are being maneuvered by a number of think tanks. They would say that, well, it's just one contingency, it's one scenario. But why then market this scenario on, if not primetime TV, a major political news in the US, NBC News? And why use a year, 2027, creating an impression that there's an impending threat and it will take place 2027, especially taking into consideration the fact that that year came from an admiral who was American and who actually had betrayed his own commanding officers by taking a ship out when he was warned not to do so because of the coronavirus. As a result, 600 Americans caught it and 102 died. So I, being a little bit cynical, I'm wondering, was this his way of shaping his own legacy, using this 2027 point as a platform to give congressional testimony when he was not interrogated about his conduct during the pandemic crisis, but his foresight for ASEAN, for Philippines, and so on and so forth? I think that ultimately you simply have to choose. You have to choose between economic development or geopolitics. And if we take that road to geopolitics, at the furthest end of it, we might find ourselves in the situation where some powers will fight with the Philippines to the last Filipino, but that's not necessarily what the Filipinos want. And that's why I think it's so important to concentrate on economic development. Austin found a slide, I won't spend time on this, but that's about Taiwan, but perhaps it's relevant as well. This was a so-called Project 24/9 Institute that was created in the US. The key player in it was Richard Armitage, who had a great role in Iran-Contra debacle in 1980s, a very controversial character. Again, you have the same sponsors, the big defense contractors, and then you have a bunch of other organizations, including Boveri Group Asia, which is connected with the ADRI in the Philippines, Open Society, National Endowment for Democracy, in whose name also Mr. McCain presented himself in Ukraine, 2014. So this path to where we are now has been plotted quite a long while ago. And the objective has been to prevent perhaps the rise of China in this case. And I, for the best of me, don't understand why you can't have both. You can have the rise of China economically. They have very little interest in military. If you look at the military expenditures in China and US and Europe, you will find out that on per capita basis, US is 20 times more, Europe maybe 10 times more. But they are willing to defend what they have achieved, which is only understandable. So that's the one thing we should do whatever we can to avoid the option or the scenario of geopolitics that would surpass the economic objectives. And I don't think that Philippines can afford it.
Thank you, Dr. Dan. But before I move on to the next question in the chat box, let me have a follow-up question for you, Dr. Dan.
Anna, can I give a little input here?
Okay, yeah. Sir. Before my follow-up question to Dr. Dan, let me call on Sir George
yes,
to have input on the question.
We can look at, since we're talking about BBM Marcos, his father was a master of the dance. Let's call that. Why do I say this as regards to China? You know, if we remember, Marcos opened the relations with China even before the US did. right? So on one hand, he was opening his arms to China and open not only with China but also with Russia and with Libya and so on. On the other hand, he's the first to put in our laws a claim on the sprat lease. No, in 1978, he put two laws for the economic zones and for the territory. So on one hand, it's like dancing with somebody, and on the other hand, you're pickpocketing, right? And we had perfectly good relations. So that's a true diplomat and a true politician. And we had excellent relations with China at that time. So second, for what reason would China be interested in invading the Philippines? There is no interest in invasion of the Philippines, but the Philippines may become a target for different reasons. Why is there no interest in the Philippines? Because if we look at the entire if we look at it from an economic basis, the entire Philippine productive capacity, about $370 billion GDP a year, no, is less than one half of 1 year's growth. Because China's growth at 6% of a $14 trillion economy, 14 trillion, we're talking about $800 billion a year growth, $800 billion a year growth. So our entire economy is sunk into just one half of a year's growth. For what reason would they risk their entire reputation and have to go through war to take over the Philippines? But there is a reason to possibly attack and invade the Philippines is actually defensive rather than offensive. If we remember, they did not start building on those islands the military capability until the Philippines started saying publicly, very publicly, that they would invite the US to come in and defend those territories against China. Now, it makes it impossible for China politicians not to react to that, because their people will say, you are going to allow the US to come in and tighten the ring noose around us, because the US has already stated that its objective is to keep tightening the ring around China. And so if we have 6 EDCA bases here and negotiating for more, and now there are all these missiles, they have to get at those missiles and attack before they reach maximum velocity. So anyone who understands military will understand that. So they have to be there, whereas they were not there before. If the US is saying that they did not protest before, that is not the case. They have been sending letters and representations and were being ignored by the US and the West, just the same as the Russian proposal to just consider mutuality of security was totally ignored by the US and the EU. Why don't you just agenda it and put it on record? They refused. No, so that is we have to see. In fact, the OSCE, the Organization for Security of Europe, European Community, has agreed in principle many years ago that you cannot enhance the security of one party without considering mutual security of all the parties. And that is what they did. So we have to understand that today, especially for powers, you cannot try to enhance your security at my expense. They will react. In fact, this is also the US policy. They are disallowing, in fact, they've sanctioned Cuba, who is totally no threat to the US for how many decades, and crushed the economy of Cuba. And they're trying to do that to Venezuela, but they're not allowing any other country to recognize. In fact, China's stated by Bobby, the resolutions they had on the majority of their territorial disputes, you know, depending on the statistics, 17 out of 23 or 23 out of 27, the majority of them have been giving a more favorable terms to the third party. So right now, there was an agreement in principle that we will do the development of the resources in the South China Sea together, and the US and the Western companies were giving the Philippines only 10% of the benefit, and we're not paying taxes on it. And China was willing to give 60%. And that 60% presumably already covers taxes. But when it came to Locsin DFA, then he insisted that they have to recognize our sovereignty. The effect, we were supposed to, from the beginning, the agreement was not to discuss sovereignty and just benefit from it together. So there are all these issues. So these are what we need to strengthen our defense. Yes, we could be a target, but not because they want to invade us, but because they need to defend themselves against this tightening ring. And we should strengthen our defense, not just against China, but for all purposes about protecting our economic as well as political issues from all parties. Why are we not talking about Sabah, which is actual territory with all these borders and around the territorial seas, 10 producing oil wells, gold, tin, mining, forestry, and then we're going to fight over water. So this is just to put in perspective this issue about, they keep saying China will attack the Philippines. There's, they have to point out what's the basis, no? And how this can be managed. In fact, China had given up over 1 million square kilometers or miles of territory of Mongolia just to give a buffer zone between Russia and China, and they're respecting it.
Yeah, I think thank you to all our speakers for responding extensively to that question. I think that question is very important, no? Especially to clarify the issue that there's such a thing as an impending threat coming from the Chinese, and it's being used to justify certain. I think I read one article. One senator of the country is speaking about this. I think this is very important issue, that such webinar is important, to clarify and to educate our public. And my follow-up question, before I read the question posted in the chat box, I have a follow-up question for Dr. Dan. And I think the other speaker can also chime in. My follow-up question is this, no? And it's very much related to the ongoing discussion. The U.S. Center for National Security, it is Biden's, President Biden's key think tank, launched a recent report on revitalizing the U.S.-Philippine alliance. It openly seeks to sustain U.S. primacy in the region. When I'm talking about the region, it basically includes the Southeast Asian region, and also, of course, the bigger Indo-Pacific region, or what you call the Asia-Pacific region. How should the Philippines read this, and what should be the attitude of the new government or under the presidency of Marcos Jr.? What should be the attitude of the Philippines with regard to this? And also, I would just also add an additional question. Since Sir George mentioned the oil and gas joint exploration, what do you think of this? Would the next administration take on this and continue to explore possible oil and gas joint exploration in the Reed Bank, or would we just forget about it? So any reaction? Of course, I will ask first Dr. Dan, since this is basically a follow-up question to your discussion earlier, and then Professor Bobby, and of course Sir George, because I've mentioned the oil and gas and joint exploration. Yes, sir?
Yes, you managed to ask very big questions in a very concise way. I will try to answer very briefly in that regard. When it comes to the notion of oil explorations, my understanding is that there is a very strong eagerness on the Chinese side to continue the talks. So it's the end of one administration is not the end of the second administration, it's the beginning of one. So this also allows you to have a clean slate. But I think that there's also a very clear understanding that the objective of the new government is to build on the legacy of the Duterte government. And the fact that the Chinese side is very eager to continue signifies or signals that they are eager also to have some sort of resolution. And perhaps now, as we have bypassing the pandemic period, which was a great distraction and terrible economic and human loss, there's more time to focus on this. I think that it's, in the long run, it is the only way to go. And I think that it is the only way to create economic basis to a security arrangement, if you will. I'm also encouraged in this regard by the choice of Clarita Carlos to be a security advisor. Not just her personality, which is very well known here in the Philippines, but her approach. The idea that security is multidimensional, that it is based on physical security, it's based on well-being, it's based on quite a few other things. And the willingness and a signaling by the Marcos administration to take that path by making note of the fact that, well, there's nothing wrong about having more people exchanges. And actually, we should have more exchanging involving the academic side, which is something that the Vice President Duterte has already made very clear. And why not focus on technology? There was a time already in the Aquino era where Chinese companies were actively looking for destination points to outsource and offshore. And purely for geopolitical reasons, I think a lot of plans fell apart. This was a loss, I think, to both sides in the long run, but it doesn't have to be an internal loss. You can now build on this new approach to find a very different reality. As to the Indo-Pacific, I think that, well, it has often been mentioned as a kind of a counterpoint to the new Silk Road. Let's be real about these things. When the Marshall Plan was created in 1949 and it lasted about 4 years, it was around $130 million, if I'm not mistaken, which today would be 10, 15 billions, something of that nature. When we're talking about this new Silk Road, we're talking about a multi-trillion-dollar plan that goes for quite a long time. That plan has been attacked, and sometimes there are people who are critical because things go wrong. Sometimes because people are ideological and don't just accept the plan. And I'm afraid that it has been the latter that has been paramount. Recent studies, if I recall, in US and UK, major research universities have shown that the exaggerated threat of debt is not paramount with this operation. There's a lot to be learned. And again, if we would have more cooperation with the Americans and the Europeans and the Japanese who've had this experience over time, and Europeans have been more willing, and the Japanese, but not the Americans. And as long as Americans are not willing, it's harder to pay footsie in that regard. I think a lot more could be achieved. But Indo-Pacific, unfortunately, seems to me to be more a geopolitical plan than economic plan. It looks into cooperation with the Quad. It talks a lot about AUKUS. As I mentioned before, it is willing to partner with India, but it doesn't really want to deal with Indian trade issues regarding the US or Europe. It just wants to have India's back in the region. And then there's the unfortunate fact that when the former Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Pompeo, presented the Indo-Pacific plan for the first time, he managed in the matter of 10 to 20 minutes to misread the entire history of Southeast Asia in forgetting all the negative things that make it pretty hard for people in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and even in Philippines, not to mention China and Korea, to take very seriously this kind of plans. It also reminded me of the fact that as much as we've seen happening in terms of South Korea and North Korea, in terms of efforts to rapprochement, détente, and so on and so forth, there's no peace agreement. No, so you start wondering, it's 70 years has passed and there's absolutely no peace agreement. Is this because there's no peace agreement or because people don't want to have a peace agreement? In the latter case, rule and divide, the old colonial principle seems to apply. So my concern with the Indo-Pacific is that irrespective of the intentions of some who have been formulating it and others who want to join it and think that they can hedge their bets, it won't work that way. It's a geopolitical plan. Its ultimate objective is security, and security at the expense of one or two other actors. And I think that the only way you can develop this region is by cooperation. And I think ASEAN can be a key player in that. Old-time veteran statesmen such as Mahathir and others and their voices about Indo-Pacific, what it is, what it says it is, and what it can do and what it won't do to ASEAN, I think are of paramount importance right now. And one more thing, if I may.
Yes, sir.
Austin keeps showing the slide, so I feel compelled to say something about it. It's a simple slide in the sense that who profits when geopolitics rules? It's always the defense contractors. Their profits have gone sky high. Here's the headline from Investors Business Daily, March 9. That was a long time ago. Russia's war on Ukraine makes defense investors $49 billion richer. Unfortunately, it happens at the expense of the people who become targets. And that's why the independence of foreign policy is so very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dan. Yes.